Welcome to all of you joining us from far and wide. My name is Claire Dool. Demand for food, water and energy will increase over the next decades due to population growth, rapid urbanisation, economic growth and climate change. But as we know, the planet only has finite resources. In this panel, we're going to look at the trade-offs and synergies needed to successfully manage competing demands for food and water. We'll hear about an approach which focuses on the interdependencies between different sectors, known as Nexus thinking. However, there are barriers to its adoption, and we will be focusing on what more needs to be done to promote and accelerate this thinking, vital if key SDG goals on food and water security are to be met. We really want to hear from you about what can be done, so do ask questions in the Q&A on the platform, and of course tweet using the hashtag WEFE4Med. And there are many organisers of this event, and here are their Twitter handles: EU_Science Hub, UFM Secretariat, Prima Programme, EU_Commission and Cyprus Institute. I'm delighted to be joined by scientists, researchers, regional and international policy experts and a farmers representative. But before I introduce them in detail to you, let's hear from the FAO's Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Ismahan Elouafi. Dr. Elouafi is also a member of the scientific group for the 2021 UN Food Systems Summit and a strong advocate for rethinking food systems. In her Nexus talk, she'll tell us more about the concept and why it's so important if we're to meet the 2030 agenda. So Dr. Elouafi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claire. It's really a pleasure to be with you today to really reveal and unpack the water, energy, food nexus. I'm really very pleased to be with you all today to discuss how can we promote evidence-based practices for an effective food-water system transformation. And before we do this, let's see a little bit unpack the term nexus per se. We all agree that water, energy, and food are key for human well-being, for poverty reduction, and sustainable development. The term nexus per se has been used in a variety of contexts with the objective of deepening our understanding of how sectors are interlinked, how sector policies impact each other, and in turn, to inform coherent cross-sectorial governance. So when resources become scarcer and demand for them increases, if we develop and implement sectorial plans independently without accounting for the physical constraints and the trade-off and impact across sector, then our society becomes more vulnerable. This is because of the spillover effect across sectorial policies that become more expensive and by the end became unsustainable. So the nexus is a very useful concept to think about how we can balance different resource users' goals and interests while maintaining the integrity and sustainability of ecosystems. And the water and energy, both of them, the use of water and energy for food are very closely interlinked. So basically we can't have food without energy and water. Therefore, action taken at the local scale that aim to improve a certain area of the nexus, of the water, energy, food nexus, may shift the burden to other areas. So in other words, it can cause a domino effect, which ultimately leads to negative consequences for water, energy, and or food security. So it's one of them or many of them at the same time. This results in several trade-offs, such as free energy in solar irrigation, for example, can lead to water overpumping, but also synergies like the use of wastewater to produce biogas and biofertilizers. So the same solution could have a negative impact or a positive impact, and we have to understand it and we have to take it in consideration. So the solar example is very clear. We can overpump water, but in the same time, we can produce biogas and biofertilizers. Trades-off in particular can be exacerbated by natural resource degradation and the impact of climate change. So managing the complex interaction between water, energy, food, ecosystems, it's therefore crucial as we strive for a more sustainable and more resilient agri-food system. All these aspects are particularly relevant to the Mediterranean region because water scarcity is often in the Mediterranean region already an issue, and things will get worse due to climate change. Second, the demand for food and energy is expected to increase in the coming decade in the Mediterranean region per se. And the third point, according to the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, CNCC, an average temperature increase of 2 degrees will generate about 6 to 12 centimeter rise in the Mediterranean sea level. And it will also induce a 5 to 10% fall in precipitation and more frequent extreme climatic events. So that's scenario 2 degrees only. So we're not looking at 4 degrees, which I'm sure many of you have seen in the latest IPCC Working Group 1 that are talking about 1.5, 2, and 4. So according to this scenario, the scenario of 2 degrees, the agricultural production of countries in the southern and eastern shores will decrease by 50% by the end of the century. So to address trade-off and harness synergies in the context of climate change, it requires an integrated approach that optimizes resource use efficiency, doing more with less, and gives due consideration to climate change adaptation, in particular regarding water management. And that's really what we get through the Nexus approach. The water, energy, food approach help us doing that, help us really have a better planning tools and a better consideration of all the variables in the equation. So allow me a little bit to highlight some opportunities for the WEFE sectors, including one of them, it's more data related to the water, energy, food nexus in the shared environment information system and the Mediterranean information system on environment and development for more better evidence-based decisions that result in more harmonized policies. FAO is working on the Plan Bleu for the Mediterranean region, in particular its dialogue strategies between partners. Second, using more systematically FAO Stat and other data sets such as Aquastat regarding water and energy use in agriculture in the Mediterranean countries. Third point, using FAO analytical tools such as the comprehensive Investa cost-benefit analysis of renewable energy investment in food chain, as it includes aspects related to water quality and water quantity, which help de-risk and optimize investments in the Nexus solution. And finally, I also would like to highlight that the Water, Energy, Food Nexus assessment methodology of FAO project entitled Implementing the 2030 Agenda for Efficiency, Productivity and Sustainability of Water in MENA region, currently applied in Jordan and also in Morocco, my own native country. So ladies and gentlemen, it is clear for us all that business as usual is no longer an option. In 2020, between 720 and 811 million were undernourished globally, which is 161 million more than just 2019. Further, it is estimated that by 2050, we will need about 50% more food, 40% more water, 40% more energy. So transitioning toward energy smart agriculture systems that optimize the use of efficient and sustainable energy is crucial. Energy smart agri-food system not only conserve energy, but can even produce it to leverage the dual relationship between energy and food. For example, the rainwater harvesting, solar food dryers, green fertilizer, food bioconservation, all of these help to conserve both water and energy and reduce waste. This is increasingly important as countries face accelerating impact of climate change. We need to adopt a holistic, coordinated approach to work collectively to transform our agri-food systems. And the water component in that transformation, it's very important. We can't have 40% more water. We don't want to keep doing too many desalination. So we need to rethink renewable water. We need to think gray water. We need to take reuse and recycle. FAO Strategic Framework 2022-2031 puts at its center the vision of leaving no one behind through more efficient, more inclusive, more resilient, and more sustainable agri-food system. And we want to do this through developing approaches and methodologies and best practices for better production, better nutrition, and better environment, and a better life to all. Thank you very much, and over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Dr. El-Wafi, really for unpacking that concept. And what I was wondering, I used to work for WWF, and they used to talk about integrated river basin management. So there are integrated approaches to resource management out there. How would you say this Nexus approach really differs? What's really at the core of it that's new?
So the new, I think it's the approach per se, how we are looking at the impacts and the trade-off. So because in national programs and in most discussion, you find a Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Water, and they tend to plan separately. But the reality of things, the things are very much interconnected. And agriculture, I always say agriculture is the sector that's gonna lose the most of it, because it's not the sector that is having the highest return on investment, and that's a reality. It's not the sector that has the most, attracting the most business in terms of business. So agriculture right now uses about 70% of the world water, but as industrialization is growing, as urbanization particularly is growing, as other sectors are coming, agriculture will get less chance. So the supply per se gonna reduce for the agriculture sector, and that's where we have really to take the nexus. We have really to connect the water with the energy, with the food, and bring also more awareness about the importance of food system and food, even if maybe the return on investment is not the highest.
Dr. El-Wafi, thank you very, very much for that, and please do stay with us as I introduced our other speakers. We have Professor Gianluca Brunori, who's Professor of Food Policy at the University of Pisa, and he's a member of the European Commission's high-level expert group to assess the need for an international platform for food systems science. He's also chair of the Joint Programming Initiative on Agriculture, Food Security and Climate Change. And I know that he has got many thoughts about how do we break the silos that Dr. El-Wafi has just spoken about. Also, please welcome Professor Semia Sherif from the University of Tunis Al Manar Higher Institute of Applied Biological Sciences. And that also Professor Sherif has been very, very instrumental in a report that's been out for many of you at the moment. Also, I would very much like to introduce some of our other panelists who are going to talk to us. Professor Ido Khan from the Department of Environmental Economics and Management at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's an agricultural economist who builds economic models for policymakers to base their decisions on. And Arianna Giuliodori, Secretary General of the World Farmers Organization. Arianna is a real strong advocate of international partnerships so that farmers can play an essential role in the sustainability transformation. So welcome to you all. And I think most probably where I should begin, Ariana, is with you, because we just heard from Dr. El-Wafi that there is going to be less water. There's real scarcity of water, as we know, in the Mediterranean region, but farming globally uses 70% of water. So given these challenges, you know, how do you view these trade-offs? Because farmers are going to have to produce more food with less water.
Thank you, Claire. I'm honored to share the panel with Dr. El-Wafi and to be here with you today. Let me start by changing the tone of the conversation. I am delighted to finally hear that science is approaching water, energy, food production, environment, exactly like the farmers have always been doing. For us, the Nexus approach is our way of doing business of the farm every day. We are the only sector that embraces the Nexus approach in the way we think, we plan, we do things on the farm every day. We are the only economic sector that struggles every day and try to implement all the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, at the very same time. Because what we do is to produce food, to take care of the environment, to carefully plan how to use natural resources, including for sure water. We could also mention soil and its health as part of this conversation. So, is it a conversation about trade-offs? I don't want to accept this approach. I think what we need is a bold effort to invest in a farmer-driven, science-based, solution-oriented approach that will help us deliver against these challenges. And if we embrace this approach, if we are bold enough to invite farmers at the table where decisions are taken and shape together the policies that are needed, we might see things changing. I'm not saying we do not have to change, all of the opposite, but there are incredible experiences out there that deserve to be shared. I could mention the efforts of farmers, our members, for instance, from the Caribbean that are investing with their own resources in drip irrigation to make sure they make a careful use of the scarce water available while trying to cope with the salinization of soils. I could refer to those farmers that in the Mediterranean region, but also elsewhere, are investing in biogas to transform livestock, not only in a powerful machine that transforms grass into proteins, but also into energy. And I think this is exactly by focusing on solutions that we will be able together to win the challenges. For sure, there's something that has to be evoked, and I'll stop here on this, and it is the power of unleashing the potential of innovation. Farmers can be powerful innovators. They are innovators by nature. What we need is a system that is enabling farmers to become the innovators they potentially are everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ariana. So I just want to go back to Dr. El-Wafi. This sense of it's not trade-offs. The farmers are doing this already. Just to get Dr. El-Wafi's point, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, so I wanted to jump in, Claire. I fully agree with Ariana. Farmers have always a risk management in their approaches. So for them, it's not the terminology trades off or not, but farmers are by nature taking all in consideration because they don't work in silos. For them, environment is environment, resources are resources, water, fertilizer, production, recycling. So it's really part of the culture and of the traditional knowledge and traditional agriculture. I always give an example of farmers in the mountain in Morocco, whereby the farmers never really adopted new varieties. And the reason why, it's because of the variability. They will say we better mix grains and seeds, because if there is a rain, these gonna come up, and if there is drought, those come up. So the risk management, it's part and parcel of the thinking. I like how Ariana put it, whereby we need really to take holistically like a farmer will do, because that's their income, that's their livelihood, and bring in its science and innovation, because what we want to do, we want to keep that approach, but we want to make it more productive in terms of calories, but also in terms of nutrients. So we want to bring science in increasing productivity because we need to, and in producing more with less. But absolutely, so we call it trades off, and I know farmers have been dealing with it forever.
Understood. So that's interesting. Farmers are already perhaps using the Nexus approach, but as both of you have alluded to, there are silos, and silos often happen in with the policymakers, as Dr. Eloifi was saying, with these separate ministries. And I would very much like to bring in now to the conversation Professor Brunori, who's an expert on policy making, and perhaps you can just illustrate some of these barriers. I know that you want to break down these silos, but what do we see, and do you think these barriers are stronger in the Mediterranean region than other regions?
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you for to the organizers for inviting me. Yes, I would start from what Mrs. Arianna was saying, that for many farmers, or most farmers, the nexus is something obvious because they live this nexus. And so the question is why there is this paradox that say that the academia, for example, this nexus is not so obvious. Why is it possible that research don't consider the nexus as an obvious thing? And you already said that there are silos. So if I am an expert in productivity of irrigation, maybe I forget that my irrigation may affect the water tables, or the let's say the availability of water, and I don't see maybe the link between climate change and biodiversity, etc. So I think that this nexus concept opens a lot of avenues for new mindsets, and this is the most important message that we can give to research, innovation, and also policy making, because this introduction of new concepts, apparently obvious, but they are new, they help to connect the dots between different things. They make links invisible that they make visible. So, and this helps to collect new data, to set new frameworks, to build new models, etc. So research really needs these new concepts in order to be encouraged to open the barriers of the disciplines and to start working together. And when we get to policy, normally academia and policy go along each parallel to each other. So we have ministries, as Ismane was saying, ministries for agriculture, ministries of food, ministries of environment or water, and each of them has an expertise base. And each expertise base is, let's say, to a certain extent motivated to go in one direction and not to look to the externalities of this. So when we start introducing a new context, we introduce new knowledge and new ways of organizing the processes. And this is the way to proceed, I think. So to answer to your question, how do we break the silos? I think that we have to consider this dialectic between, let's say, the frameworks, so the mindsets and the policies, and understanding that there are no new policies if there are no new mindsets, but at the same time, in order to foster new mindset, we need to have new policy principles. And for example, the Sustainable Development Goals are really something that drives science towards dealing with problems rather than being stuck within their discipline.
I was just wondering, Professor Brunari, do you see that the mindsets are more entrenched in the Mediterranean region than other regions, that really they need to shift? There needs to be a bigger shift in mindset and policies in this region rather than other regions?
I would say that in some countries we may see a more, let's say, hierarchical governance or fragmented governance, and this doesn't help, because if you have a collaborative and cooperational governance, you have the possibility to make different domains speak to each other. And if you don't have them, you will have, let's say, conflicts between bodies of administrations. You will have these conflicts, let's say, mirrored in the academia, etc. And I would say that I cannot say that in Mediterranean areas there is more rigidity than in other countries. But I would say that in general, we really need to think about these governance issues, and the participation, especially of farmers, is the key to break this approach and to open the governance.
Dr. El-Wafi.
Yes, Claire, just to add to the point of Dr. Gianluca, for me, really, we are not celebrating enough the good examples. So in the Mediterranean, we have very good examples that we need to bring forward, and we need institutional innovation or governance innovation as well. So there is certain examples of how certain countries brought the sectors together, closer, either through a special committee, for example, or special institutions, and those have really brought together the sectors to think as a system, not to think I'm pushing for this agenda or that agenda. So I think, and globally this year, we got a really a very unique year where the climate change agenda, it's aligned with the food security agenda and with the biodiversity agenda. And that's really encompasses three areas that could be in many ways are a broader nexus that we need to look at. Just to say that we need to celebrate those good examples and we need to talk about them.
That was a beautiful segue into exactly where I was going next, because I would very much like to introduce Professor Ido Khan and Professor Sharif, because in their work, they've been working on models, applying this nexus thinking, trying to break the cycles, and have some examples of good practice for us. So Professor Khan, if I can start with you. I introduced you as saying that you made economic models for decision makers to make their decisions on. Perhaps you could tell us a little about how you try and apply this nexus thinking and persuade the decision makers in Israel to adopt it.
So historically, what I did is building two separate models, one of the Israeli water system and the other of the vegetative agricultural system. And eventually I combined them together, and then I learned that there is a word to it, nexus. So I was very happy that I'm really connected to this issue. The point is that if you begin with the farmers, then farmers are doing their best subject to constraints. And one of the constraints is the policy. the policies that are imposed on them. Also, the other users of water, like the urban users, they also do their best subject to the constraints, which is the policy, for example, of the pricing system. So those who are controlling those agents are actually the policymakers. And when they are doing these policies or design the policies, they have to take into account all the effects. And here, I think that from my experience, modeling is economic modeling is a very efficient tool to provide some information about the impact of policy changes and reforms. For example, in Israel, the water sector is heavily regulated, and also the farming sector. The farmers are protected by import taxes, and the government also controls the water prices and quotas. The Ministry of Finance, they offer to change the support to farmers to abolish the import taxes, and by this they actually will affect the water consumption, the irrigation water consumption. Especially that in Israel, we use irrigation water. Most of the irrigation, or maybe half of the irrigation water, is wastewater, which is the way we dispose of wastewater, the sewage water that is produced by the urban sector. So if you change the policy, something in the policy with respect to the agricultural sector, then it affects the cities that have to find other ways to dispose of their wastewater. So we use this integrated model to check this. Now, there are some advantages of building such models, aside of checking the impact of reforms. For example, it requires to define the problem, including the objectives. You have to decide about the decision variables, the external factors, for example, the climate, and what are the constraints. Some people don't understand the difference. For example, cost recovery, is it an objective or a constraint? The other advantage is that the model needs data, so its development helps to identify data gaps. And finally, the model enables discussion of policy impacts in terms of monetary terms, which is what's required when budgets are negotiated. Specifically, what we found is that abolishing the import tariffs will reduce irrigation water consumption by 20%, and this will therefore require considerable investment in improving the wastewater quality, so it will be able to be discharged into natural waterways.
Thank you. So we can see the integrated economic models are one solution, so that decision makers can make their decisions taking a sort of nexus integrated approach. Let's hear from Professor Sharif. You've worked on many research projects, I know, such as groundwater for irrigation. Can you give us one example of best practice in your field where this thinking is actually being applied?
Hello, thank you very much for this invitation. In fact, I think that Dr. El-Wefi has said everything that is a kind of abstract of what has to be said here. But I would just want to point that the Mediterranean region is not only very scarce, but it's the highest. It has the highest level of scarcity in the world. So pluviometry and rainfall, so it's very low, and the input in the aquifers are lower than the output for irrigation, and that leads to salty waters, groundwater depletion, and also other factors like biological and agricultural, so pesticides, nitrate nutrients, and biological with bacteria, contamination. So groundwater is really a problem in the Mediterranean, and it's not only in the south but also in the north and the east. All the parts of the Mediterranean have this problem of groundwater. But what I seen in my research and with my interaction with policymakers is that the policy until now was to broaden irrigation areas. You see what I mean? They want to broaden it in order to regulate the agricultural fluctuations due and dependent on rainfall. So they want more irrigation, more irrigated areas in order not to depend on the rainfall. But in my opinion, this is not a consistent approach. As long, of course, as we are not developing other resources like alternative resources like the reuse of treated wastewater for irrigation or the recharge of the aquifers with these used water that are already treated and sometimes very clean, or use of grey waters, etc. So the problem here is that we need absolutely an evolution in the approach of agriculture. It should be taken by policymakers, by farmers, of course, but also by all the people, because it's an awareness that should be put in place by education and essentially at the high level education, because even deciders that have high diplomas cannot understand this approach. They want the old way of doing. They are just I cannot understand how it is, but I think it's just we are used to do some kind of things. We have learned it at school, so we want to apply it. And now it's time to change this ideas. We have to adapt to environmental conditions and not force nature to adapt to us, to our desires. So this is very important. And it can be done because we have the scientific tools. It's not a problem of science. There is tens of thousands of innovative ways to manage water and to manage energy, and even more for agriculture. So the tools exist to tackle nexus components, water, energy, food, and I think the will is the tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sharif. So we have the science, we have the models, there's the will amongst the farmers. Let me just go back to you, Dr. LOFE, because I know that the FAO facilitates this thinking with member states who are interested. And you mentioned earlier that you were working with Jordan and Morocco. Can you take us through how do you help them apply this thinking and change their mindsets?
So there are a number of initiatives. I mentioned some of them whereby really FAO is working with the member state to really come along the nexus, which is really going back to nature and thinking the way nature is made. And the way we are really approaching it, namely, it's really to work with different governments on building evidence, on doing scenario planning and response option. So there are three areas really that we think the Nexus challenge requires to invest more. First, it's providing evidence, and that's really science and data. It's developing scenarios with the different climatic scenarios that we have, and designing and appraising a response option. And there are examples of really good practices in the Mediterranean region, such as we mentioned the sustainable solar irrigation, not with overpumping that we saw in the MENA region. In many countries, we have full cost pricing, for example, or environmental fees of water use. I could bring up Turkey, which is also a member of the Mediterranean region, where the government provides support to farmers that implement innovative irrigation system and water efficiency measures. We got Jordan that has really for years have been using wastewater reuse almost completely. There is also Spain that I have also to mention that reuse like the highest number of reuse of wastewater in the world. It's Spain. So, but going back to Jordan, not only they use wastewater, but also they use wastewater for biogas and fertigation. In Lebanon, we have institutionalized integration of water and energy, and there are many other examples. So the idea is really that what FAO is trying to do, it's build up data, and it's do country-to-country learning, South-South or South-South, and triangular, different methodologies. But there is some challenges, sincerely, Claire. And one of the challenges is the lack of precise and uniform data for the whole Mediterranean region, which results in insufficient information on the advantage of the Nexus approach and documentation to support it. There is institutional barriers due to the need for more cross-sectorial and cross-level cooperation to implement the Nexus approach in many of the countries, but also in partnership between countries. And of course, Dr. Gianluca, he mentioned the non-harmonized policies and regulation between the water, the energy, and the food sectors. So we have those challenges on all levels, but the idea of FAO is really to build up the data, to build up the scenarios, and then provide really a suite of options and solution for the member states to pick up from.
Understood. Professor Brunari, you were saying, of course, and we've been looking very much at policymakers, and I'll come to Ariana in a moment about what she would like to see from policymakers. But before I go to you, Ariana, I'm just thinking there's policy, but there's also mindset shift that you've been talking about, Professor Brunari. So do you think there needs to be a mindset shift amongst the academic or the scientific communities, the communities that Ido and Semia represent? Do they need to get out of their laboratories and do more advocacy? What do you think?
Yes, I think that with the Sustainable Development Goals, so we have entered in a new phase for research. 20 years ago, we were accustomed to apply for projects within the sector. So I am an agriculturalist, and then I apply to research projects on agriculture. And let's say the call are related to specific themes within the sector. With the Sustainable Development Goal, we are starting to think in terms of societal challenges and to broader goals. So if the goal is food security, as researchers now, we are asked to link all the disciplines and all the, let's say, the research activities to this goal, and to see how this principle get across different types of approaches. And for this reason, I think that researchers should not listen only to their colleagues within the lab, but going outside the lab, because with interaction, they can understand what the problems are, when the barriers are, whether the solutions are feasible or not. And in some cases, they can listen to local knowledge, which is sometimes, it's very often very important, because it helps to understand what are the constraints, but also the opportunities for this. And as I've seen also in the chat some question or some comment, maybe I can, let's say, link to it in relation to farmers. In some cases, farmers do the right decision in relation to the constraints they have. So if pricing, for example, of water let's say, encourage them to use more water that is necessary, they will use it, but there is not their fault. It's the problem of the rules. If the infrastructures are obsolete, for example, and they are inefficient, farmers try to adapt to these infrastructures. So what is important here is to understand that if we change our mindsets at level of policies, at level of research, we will give more resources also to farmers to better understand the links between their water management and other aspects, including the issues of pollution, depletion, biodiversity, etc.
Professor Khan, can I just ask you then, in your area, do you see that there is a mindset shift, that more people in your field are doing Nexus thinking? Any thoughts about what Professor Brunari has just said?
Yes, we have to understand how the academy is working. Academic people are like everyone else. They want to maximize their utility, their income, and so forth. So they want to publish because this is the way they are being promoted in the degrees in the university. And within each disciplinary, which is defined by departments, you have different ways to promote yourself. And it's the question is, where do you want to publish, and where the people above you are directing you to publish. If I am an agricultural or environmental economist, then it's okay for me to publish in, for example, a journal like Ecological Economics, okay? But if I'm in the Department of Economics, then it's a low-ranked journal, relatively, to other, which more prestige journals. So it depends on in which department you work, and what is the meaning of publishing, what will promote you. And we see, I think that we see more and more departments that are more interdisciplinary departments, or we see more and more combinations of departments. For example, my department, which is the Environmental Economics and Management, belongs to an institute of environmental sciences. So they promote collaboration with other departments in the same institute, which is a good way for this nexus that we are thinking about promoting.
Professor Sharif, do you see that transdisciplinary approach in Tunisia?
In fact, I think that you are asking me about Tunisia, but I would just say something else. In fact, I saw that, for example, in Europe, and especially in some university in France, the development of Nexus, not only the Nexus we are talking about, for example, the Nexus just in chemistry and biology, for example, has begun in the beginning of the 90s. But it is not accepted really until now. Until now, we have the commissions. For example, in Tunisia, if you have commission, you have commissions of chemistry, physics, biology, and you know, everything is separated, and physics, and in another place you have agriculture. So it's completely separated. I know it because I'm in many commissions, and I see that in commission of chemistry, sometimes we talk about environment, about agriculture, about biology, and so I'm very useful for that. But I see that my colleagues, they want every time separate all this, you know, this domains. They don't want it to be. And many times they ask me, "Are you biologist or chemist?" I say, "Okay, I have both diploma." So they don't accept it, and it's a kind of deny of this relation between the domains that are every time they are related. You cannot separate between chemistry and biology, and we see it in the environment. And when you talk about pollution, for example, are we talking about chemical or biological pollution? Both of them are dangerous. Of course, one is killing immediately, the other one will kill after 20 or 30 years. So no, I don't think this nexus is really, no, I don't think that is, not only in Tunisia, I think in many countries, they don't relate the cement, for example, plant that is polluting and putting some greenhouse gases in the air, and the fact that they will have water for irrigate their culture, or they will have less fish in the sea, you see. So
Dr. Eloise wants to come in here. I knew she would, about promoting this.
Tanya, it's really, it's an issue that we have in many areas, whereby we are a little bit creating more silos, and we are simplistic in our way. And nature, and maybe that's also go back to what Ariana said. Nature, it's not simple. Nature, it's millions and billions of creatures living together. And there's a lot of synergies, and there's a lot of feedback. There is a lot of interactions going on. And what we tend to do is really put things in silos. And that's really what we need to back off from. Things doesn't happen alone. Things are interconnected, like water, energy, and food are interconnected. So is the biggest agenda. And I want to bring that this is an issue. I'm very happy that we have many academicians with us, because it's an issue of education. So I would never forget, I was in Cornell University in '99, and there was a very famous writer called Nawal Saadawi. She's from Egypt. She came to give a talk, and I got in, and what she said, the first thing she said, I'm gonna try to undo in you for the next 2 hours what education has done to you, which is creating you, putting you in a box, and really limiting your thinking. And I would never forget it, because that was really something, because she's very famous in thinking that really the way we are educating our kids right now, it's putting them in silos. It's putting them to be very specialized in one area and lose completely perspective of the others. I like how Samia brought it, because it's really beyond only water and energy and food. It's so many other nexuses that we need to adopt. This is the only way to go forward, because we can't solve one thing and leave the other things and not think about trade-off or impact or interactions and synergies. Yeah.
I'm going to go to some audience questions. There's a lot for Ariana, but before I ask some of these questions to Ariana, I'd just like to get her reflection as a practitioner representing the farmers, and to hear, what do you need from policymakers? What do you need from the academics, the researchers, to make it even easier for the farmers to apply this thinking? You say they're doing it, but what do you need from all of these different groups?
Thanks, Claire. Actually, there are a lot of inspiring thoughts that have been shared so far by all the speakers, and I think that there are some keywords that will help me also answer to your question. There were clear reference to the fact that we need scientists to go out of laboratories. I'm grateful to Professor Brunori for this, because it's true. We need science not to be closed in the so-called ivory tower, and to be out there together to the farmers. So what do we need from science? We need science to listen to farmers. We are not scientists. We will never be, but we need science to understand what a farmer really is. It starts even with the definition of a farmer. There's a misunderstanding, and there's a tension between a vision of a very nasty agribusiness guy that wants to pollute, which is not what the farmers are, or on the opposite, an idea of extremely poor people that are simply starving and trying to connect one day to another. And this is not true either. So if we could start working together, abandoning stereotypes, abandoning our traditional knowledge, maybe to then reiterate it afterwards in a new way. That is what the farmers need. And from governments, again, we don't simply need to be consulted. We need to sit at the table together. We need strong, independent farmers' voices. We need organized agriculture in every country of this world, not only the Mediterranean, to ensure that we can gather the voice of the very remote rural areas and transform them into a powerful tool to tackle the SDGs. We are in the decade of action. We are already at the end of 2021. And this is a beautiful picture. This panel is proving that where international organizations, science, farmers, we could add the private sector, the civil society, we must join hands, overcome stereotypes, overcome ideas that are old and obsolete, and elaborate, taking into account the goals that we have. So this is what we want. And this is not just simply what we need, this is also what we offer. Farmers are now here with a voice, and we are here to say we want to work together. I saw questions in the chat box, and for sure there's a lot that farmers can do better. I have never said we can't do better. We want to do better, but we must change the framework. We must make sure, for instance, that the policies are not simply asking to produce more, but the policies are coherently providing the framework and the investment sets so that we can produce better on less ground, on less land, for instance, with less water. And this is something that we cannot do on our own. And this is something that policy can't do on its own and science can't do on its own. We are bound together. We must understand it. And it's now or never.
Before I take some of those questions that have come in, Ariana, just a thought there. I think we've just finished the UN Food Systems Summit. Was Nexus thinking discussed there? I suppose you could argue that it might be an example of Nexus thinking because it was multi-stakeholder and there were farmers and the private sector and NGOs. But was Nexus thinking discussed there, and did anything concrete come out of it?
So first and foremost, so we have here Dr. Alouafi, that was one of the eminent representatives of the scientific group of the UN Food Systems Summit, which I think is one of the most important components of the reflection of the summit. But yes, I am quite optimistic about the fact that this summit managed a unique and incredibly powerful challenge, is to bring together actors across all sectors and very different voices from global north and global south under the umbrella of this challenge of achieving the SDGs, and finally putting food at the center. Not agriculture, not simply food security, not climate, not nutrition, but all together under the same umbrella. And you know what? Again, wow, welcome to our world. This is what the farmers are doing every day, coping with food security, with the changing climate, with water scarcity, trying to make sure that we provide the freshest and healthiest food possible, and making sure that we take care of our families and our communities. So that's, for me, that's a huge achievement. But if you want to know what the farmers really think, we think that that was just a summit. So we are now looking into the implementation phase. So, okay, we had beautiful conversations, and I think we shaped incredibly powerful new relationships and potential alliances. But now we need on the grassroots level to make it happen. We need to promote those approaches with countries. We need to have farmers in each and every national pathway that are involved and in the conversation. And we need to create food systems and not simply supply chains. You know, supply chain is a very outdated word for us. This is an industrial approach to how to provide your own business with what you need, that you call raw material. But we are now talking about food, and we, the farmers, we are the people that are producing food. So I am optimistic, but I also have very high expectations.
And Dr. Elouafi, what was your take on the UN Food Systems Summit and what Ariana has just said?
So I agree with Ariana. I think really for the first time we are talking food system level, system approach, system level thinking. So, and that's really first time ever. Before we have been really talking about value chains, but we didn't go beyond that. So when we talk about food system, we're including infrastructure, we're including energy, we're including players that they were not part of the value chain, like health players and the nutrition impact on the broader consumer. So the food system, for me, it's a great thinking at the system of the food, at the food system level. It's in itself success. That's why, because not only we're bringing the nexus we are talking about now, which is the Minister of Energy and maybe Minister of Water and Minister of Agriculture, but we're bringing in Minister of Infrastructure, we're bringing in Minister of Health, we're bringing in Minister of Environment on the pollution side, for example. So it's really much more broader, and it's the first time ever. We never really talked about food system. We had few summits on the nutrition, we have few summits on agriculture, few summits on climate change. We didn't bring them together. Now it's back to Rome, as it was written on the Colosseum, whereby the UN Rome-based agency is going to link up with all actors and implement the coalitions. And that's really where the meat is, Ariana. It's really some of the coalition might be a repetitive of what we have, but that will provide us maybe a space to bring in other actors. And by the end, in my mind, sincerely, it goes back to what we got just the members to approve, which is our FAO strategy on having better production, better nutrition, better environment, so people, all of us, have a better life and leaving no one behind. So I think those better in that sequence, in that order, are very important to keep in mind. And we can do so with science and innovation and with bringing all the actors together.
Let me then now go to some of the questions that have been flooding in. And Ariana, I think this is from the Cyprus Broadcasting Corporation, who is actually just questioning, do farmers even know about the Nexus approach? How updated are farmers on the latest development? You say it doing naturally, but the question is, do they really see this thinking?
I don't want to sound unpleasant, but do they really need to know what Nexus is? This is not the point. What we need is farmers' organizations, those who are called to represent the voice of the farmers, to be up to date and to work together with science and all the actors so that they can drive to the farmers in their own language what they need. A farmer is an entrepreneur. A farmer is an economic actor that plans. So some of them are very advanced and they know, but we don't need them to own the concept of Nexus. We need them to embrace the approach. And as I said, they naturally do feel it in what they do. That would be my point.
Perhaps another question for you, Ariana, and also to Dr. Elouafi, which is, Dr. Elouafi mentioned farmers in the mountains. So Ariana, how much are the needs of small farmers, do you think, considered in these policies? That's the question.
Claire, sorry, in which policies? In the ones that we have to shape?
The Nexus, yeah, well. The Nexus policies, this is always the disadvantage of virtual questions, because if they were in the room, you could ask for clarification. So all I can do is read the question. Yeah. Perhaps the gentleman who wrote the question might want to give some clarification, but I think it is about the needs of small farmers.
Yeah. Let me be clear to this gentleman. Farmers in the remote rural areas, being it mountains or close to the deserts, they are heroes, and we should pay them much more than what we do, because they are saving us from natural disasters. They are our barriers to the forces of nature that could simply see the mountains could really crumble down if we didn't have those heroic farmers, for instance. And the policies need to take them into account much more. There are measures, and there are in some regions around the Mediterranean, particularly in Europe, there are within the rural development policies, for instance, specific measures to support agriculture in remote rural areas like the mountains, but much more needs to be done. So I'm grateful because he gave me the opportunity to celebrate those farmers. But there are also, and with this I'll stop, sorry, but the farmers also have other arrows that they can leverage, and they are multifunctional. They can also provide services. They can integrate. It's not only about production. There's a philosophy behind agriculture and small-scale producers. They can be a real force to drive the viability of rural communities. We count on them. Where the farmers disappear, nature becomes sometimes a danger, and rural communities die. And excessive urbanization is not what we wish for the future.
Dr. El Wafi, you mentioned that you were doing some work with Jordan and Morocco on Nexus, and does that take in the needs of these small farmers?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think smallholder farmers constitute the majority of the farmers in most of the least and middle income countries, at least. So it's very important to take them in consideration, and they don't have the same access to policymakers. They don't have lobbying like maybe that you could find in Canadian farmers, for example, have very strong lobbying that are very close to Ottawa. So, but not in the South. We don't have much that. And that's where it's very important to take the small scale farmers' views and needs particularly. And that's really, I remember one of the colleague, I think Juan Luca, he talked about incentives to bring the Nexus approach together. Same thing, we need really incentives to the farmers, the small scale holder farmers, to really make sure that we are hitting all the points that we want. So when we think about, for example, putting in place small scale irrigation, it's a must for most of the small scale farmers when you think in a region like the Sahel or like the deserts and what have you. So maybe we have to look at how could we incentivize, have subsidies, have a policy framework that allows them to have access to that small scale irrigation. It could be based on renewable energy, and having at the same time a monitoring system that we don't get in the over pumping of the groundwater, that we have data on the quality of and quantity, but also quality of the groundwater that Samia mentioned as well. So there are many, it's a must, and that's really how it should be. If you wanna serve the biggest portion of your population that is producing still most of the food in most of the countries, you have to take them in consideration, and you have to find ways and means to give them a voice through maybe association, grouping. It changed from country to country, from culture to culture as well. But it's a must, absolutely.
Ido, there's a technical question in your area here. A desalinated water is supplied to the cities, and the wastewater is treated and used for irrigation only. Is it effective to desalinate wastewater to the level it can be used as drinking water? Or does it make sense to use desalinated seawater directly for agriculture and not solely for drinking water?
Well, in the case of Israel is the farmers get their income from fruit and vegetables mostly. We are importing grains because we are dry country. So that's where they are doing the money from, and these crops are relatively sensitive to salinity. So we checked and we found that in some cases it is worthwhile to desalinate wastewater and even seawater for irrigation. But may I comment something about the discussion before about communities? Ariana just said that there is a value for having farming communities. Now, if you look at the developed countries relative to developing countries, you see that the agricultural sector is shrinking in developed countries. And this is because of the other opportunities that people have and the technological progress. As technological progress is proceeding, then prices of the food are going down and the prices of the inputs are becoming higher because you use more machinery and more fertilizers and more inputs. And so people cannot survive if they are small communities or small farmers. If you have half an hectare, then you cannot afford it anymore, and you have to lease your neighbor's land if you want to stay in the business, and your neighbor is then leaving to the city because they have another opportunity. So what we see is we are talking about innovation and things like that. Technological progress is actually is the enemy of the small communities. If we see this is an objective as an objective to retain them, then we have to think what economic or technological progress is doing to them.
Ido, there's a question from a colleague, I would imagine, from the University of Bologna, and I ask you to keep the answer very short, which is, which economic model did you use?
This is a mathematical programming model. That's what it is called. MyWAS value.
There we are. Thank you for that short answer. There's also a question, perhaps Professor Brunori. The question is, why is there an academic focus only on the economic dimensions and how to formulate public policies according to the logic of technocrats? And therefore, why is there no interest or purely strategic research at the level of political and security dimensions? Professor Brunari. And if you were able to unmute yourself.
Yes, sorry. No, it was already discussed earlier that in the academia there is mechanisms of let's say self-growth and self-assessment, and sometimes not having enough let's say ears toward the outside, and also systems of incentives and also penalties, but only internal systems of evaluation. The disciplines tend to develop just internally, and but at the same time they can be permeable to economic interests. So it is possible that when there are let's say private companies that bring in one direction, it is normal that the researchers tend to let's say to have a resonance with the private interests goal. And so I think that also researchers, as the farmers or other stakeholders, respond to the inputs of the environment. They have their own principles, but at the same time they mediate these principles with the outside environment. So the challenge, I think, is to create a research system, a research policy system in which researchers are for example, considered responsible for the outcomes of their research. So they cannot just say, I'm doing research because I like this and because this is innovative. You have to explain what kind of impact your research will have on real life. And in order to understand what the impact you will have on real life, you have to know better the realities where you are going to have an impact. So I think that this is really related to how the incentives and the policy environments are shaped. And on this regard, I think that the new wave started with the mission-oriented research, with the societal challenges, etc., can open really new avenues to research.
Thank you. And I would like to say thank you to our audience for asking some of these questions. And some of you are asking where you can find out more about Nexus thinking. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that tomorrow morning there is going to be a breakout session on defining a community of best practice. And I think that we've had our own community this morning. And so I'd like to thank Dr. Eloafi, Ariana Giuliardari, Professor Sharif, Professor Khan, Professor Brunari, who are representing international regional policymakers, also researchers and academics. It's a community, but the network, the Prima network, want to build a community and set one up. And tomorrow there's going to be a breakout session about how to do that. From us, I would like to say that we are now just on time. So it's most probably time for some of you for lunch, but in 2 hours' time, there will be another panel discussion. So please do tune in. But from this panel discussion, that's all from us at the moment. Thank you very, very much for participating, attending, and watching. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. You're all very welcome to session 3 of the 2021 WEFE Nexus Science Advances Conference. I'm Karen Coleman. I'm a journalist and a broadcaster from Ireland, and I specialise in EU and international issues, and it's my pleasure to moderate this afternoon's session. So as you probably know, a key aim of this conference is to look at the topic of addressing interdependencies. And one of its aims is to analyse the role of science as a driver of innovation and how it can interact with policy and decision-making processes. So the theme of this Nexus talk for this session is which science for the identification of Nexus targets and their translation to inputs for policy making. And that will be followed by a panel discussion that will focus on the following theme: a step change in science to enable Nexus policy decisions through consensus. So the aim really of this session is to highlight scientific findings and analyse the range of potential options available to help design effective natural resource allocation systems, and in the process to promote policy decisions by consensus. We also hope to address how to integrate a balanced perspective when it comes to social, economic and human health ecosystems. As with the other sessions, we would really like to hear what you have to say during our sessions when our keynote speaker is talking and during our panel debate. Please submit any questions you would like to put to the panel and our keynote speaker through the question channel on your screen, and we will try and get to as many of them as possible. So just to explain logistically, in order to ensure we don't have a packed screen at the beginning of this session, I will introduce our panelists after the Nexus talk. So now let's go to our keynote speaker. Professor Wolfgang Kramer is an environmental geographer and a global ecologist, and the research director at the CNRS Mediterranean Institute for Biodiversity and Ecology in Aix-en-Provence in France. He is a contributor in many roles to the IPCC, and he's been working as the lead author for the 6th assessment report. In his Nexus talk, Professor Kramer is going to give us some information now about the MED-ECC, which is a science community-led process that produced a risk assessment of environmental change in the Mediterranean basin. And he's also going to look at how and why he believes policymakers ignore key findings from the likes of the MED-ECC and what lessons can be learned from all of that. Professor Kramer, you're very welcome, and I'm going to hand over our virtual stage to you now. Really looking forward to hearing your keynote speech.
Thank you very much, Karen, for the introduction. I hope you can see my slides there. Yes, that should be good. There's not I don't see the top part of the slide, but maybe other participants do that, see it completely. In any case, yes, I want to use a few minutes to talk about basically our Mediterranean experience from the last 6 years on synthesizing the science that exists on the issues of environmental change and the risks associated with them, and synthesizing them in such a way that they might hopefully translate into policymaking and to improve policymaking, because of course if there had been appropriate environmental policies in the past, then we wouldn't see the problems that we are facing these days. If I can have the second slide, please. It's no surprise for any one of you that the Mediterranean basin is warming. It's warming actually faster than the rest of the world, which is the case for many land and coastal regions. And we have this famous situation that we see in many IPCC diagrams, that we have actually still a choice. We have a choice between the blue corridor in this slide, which is essentially indicating an additional degree or so of warming towards the end of the current century, or a substantially higher 4.4, 4.5 degree warming. And those are not scientific issues, they are policy issues. And actually the whole, you could say, a large part of the motivation for our effort in the past has been to convince policymakers that we need much more substantial efforts to stay in the blue path rather than in the red one. And I won't surprise you if I have to say that at the moment we actually do not see this turnaround happen. If we look at the next slide, then it is an illustration from a study made actually by the Cyprus Institute and other colleagues in the past. It is a very strong illustration for what it means to be in the red path. It shows for the major cities of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East how much summer temperatures are actually going to be warming in the distribution between slightly colder and slightly warmer summers, between the blue situation today and the orange situation in the future. In other words, a complete shift of regime. What you would think of as a particular hot day today will be considered a rather cool summer day by the end of the century if this scenario comes true. So that part of the problem is well known, has been actually well known for some time, and we are talking here about how to better communicate and turn that into policy. Next slide. Similar issues as with warming are, of course, the case with sea level rise, which is an accelerating mechanism at the moment. We see every year a little bit faster sea level rise than before, and we have this big question, like, where will we be at the end of the century? Note that the time scale here is to 2150, and it shows us that by the middle of the next century, it will demand very dramatic action and action now to actually maintain sea level rise at below 1 meter. And there's a significant and substantial risk that it will be many meters higher depending on what happens in the big ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica. Next slide, just as an illustration what this means for cultural heritage. I think you've jumped over the one slide there, but anyhow, that was a Venice picture with a Marcus Square in underwater that you've all seen before. And this is only the warming. And now the next slide that we've just seen is another issue. It's ocean acidification, also a direct impact of climatic change, of increased greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. It is a known phenomenon. It is observed in the Mediterranean. And yet again, the next picture shows you the impacts that we are already observing, not just of acidification, I should be precise, but of warming, but the acting together of acidification and warming leads us to a situation where most of the marine ecosystem will be substantially changed and in many cases die because of during heat waves, such as here is the case with the corals. Next slide. On land, it is clear that the warming, a little bit also the reduction in rainfall, will lead to a continuing reduction in freshwater availability, and this is the case all around the basin, but it will be particularly painful in the south where water is already short, particularly for the most important water user for agriculture. And then yet the next slide shows you an additional dimension of the problems that we are already observing. Those are the heavy storms, the heavy flood events that we see here in this case in the northern part of the basin, which gain in strength and intensity with warming, with the enhanced energy content in the atmosphere. I could go on like this. I have slide sets for all lengths of talks, I was going to say, with these kinds of findings, but I want to talk to the policy issue today. So let me pick up the next slide and tell you what we did as a scientific community in 2015 when we were in preparation for the scientific background of the COP21 conference in Paris. We essentially came together with initially about 45, but now over 700 scientists. We said, well, it must be so that policymakers do not have sufficient information. Otherwise, they would act in a much more substantial way. So let's put the existing information together in a more structured sense, and maybe then something will happen, and we will also be ready to speak to them through a designed regional science policy interface. Next slide, please. So very quickly, since 2015, we went through various rounds. We followed a method and a procedure that's been developed over decades by the IPCC. And I don't go take you through all these steps here, but by the end of last year, we did release a 600 pages report based on the published and existing literature. And we also had the pleasure that the Council of Europe actually awarded its North-South Prize to us, recognizing that this is a part of democracy, to make sure that scientific information is available. Next slide. So that's what the report looks like. It is freely downloadable from the website you find at the bottom, from the medic.org website. It has 6 main chapters that I don't need to take you through here. It has a summary for policymakers, very carefully designed and discussed with a number of policymakers. And right at this moment, it is being distilled into a small chapter that will be part of the forthcoming IPCC Working 2 report, which is to be released next February. So where does this take us? Next slide, please. For me, there are 2 questions to be asked. One is that given that even after 30 years of effort by the IPCC, current policies for the protection of the climate, and I have to say also for biodiversity, are so clearly inadequate, do we actually really need new science for better policies? I have my doubts about that one. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I really have a feeling that many of us have given our the professional part of our lives to provide as good science as possible for better policies, and we are not seeing these policies at the moment yet. But given just in a more positive tone, if the answer is yes, if we need new science, then what kind of science would this be? Next slide, please. You could say a method and a process of synthesis that the IPCC has been developing over the years was the science of synthesis of the existing knowledge by developing these, what we now call the burning embers diagrams, which are diagrams that summarize a lot of information and basically organize the information along temperature scales so that nobody really can say anymore, no, we didn't really know that 2 degrees of warming meant the end of warm water corals in the tropics. No, we didn't really know that tourism will have a harder future as an economic sector. Here in some very simple diagrams, we see that the risks are clearly communicated, and I think we cannot communicate them any clearer than that. Next slide. There's one important outcome, if you will, from the IPCC work in the past, and that is that it is actually not just about looking at one risk at a time and trying to minimize that risk. It is actually necessary to develop new pathways for the economy and for society that allow transitions to take place, systems transitions. This is a very techno term, if you will, these transitions. In many cases, this will actually feel more like a revolution for many involved. It will mean that the various way how we organize our economy and our policy structures, basically our participation policy, needs to be rethought and needs to be reorganized so that we actually achieve a totally different pathway for these drivers of environmental change. And this is the climate side. This was from the 1.5 degrees report in 2018. The next slide gives you a similar answer that was given by IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which also asks for transformative changes. Without them, and states clearly that without them, sustainability cannot be achieved, and certainly not by 2030. And the IPBES is actually now taking the next step and is asking or is preparing a special report on what those transformative changes might be. I only have 2 last glimpses for you on where this kind of systems thinking in terms of transformation has been bringing some fruit already. Next slide. This is a study with unfortunately French labeling, but you will get the general idea. It is a study that was made some years ago, asking the question that if we turn the entire agricultural sector in Europe, considering existing economic structures, considering existing knowledge and technologies, considering the physical potential to produce food, considering consumer interests, if we turn that into something that we label broadly as an agroecological system, rather than the mass production and export-oriented system that we have at the moment, then we are able to transform the sector entirely so that we have 45% less production of greenhouse gases than we have today compared to what we have today. And this is not just some kind of fancy technology future science fiction scenario. This is a very realistic assessment about what agriculturalists can do, what the agroalimentary sector can do. This is possible, and it's probably not the last word either. There are many more things that can be done. The last slide I want to draw your attention to is from a different kind of transformative study, also already dating a few years back, from Otto et al., asking ourselves if we are to move into a transition towards a new system, towards a more sustainable society, then we have to ask ourselves which part of society can we actually transform? Is it easier to transform our settlements, for example, create carbon neutral cities, or is it easier to do a lot of climate education or to produce our energy in a different way? Which are the timescales where these changes can be achieved, and how difficult will it be, how costly, and how quickly will it lead us to a more sustainable system? I personally like these studies very much. I think there's a lot of science to be done in the science of transformation, but it will all not be useful if we do not really find ways to move out of this cognitive dissonance situation that we have had illustrated to us just 2 days ago in the German national elections, where essentially 86% of the population voted for something like, well, let's better not have too much change. If we're not able to leave that kind of thinking that change is necessarily bad and that the changes that are upon us from the changes of the environment, that they are something that will sort of go away with a little bit of technology. If we do not leave that thinking, then I think no science effort on Earth will be able to resolve the crisis, and we are really going to a very dark future. I still hope this is not the case, but hope means taking much more significant action and actually perhaps reform our way to produce science as well. That's what I wanted to tell you, and I hope it generates some discussion. So thank you very much for the moment.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very, very interesting. You raised a lot of very good questions that I think really people would like you to explore perhaps more. I'm going to put a few to you now before I introduce our panelists to broaden out the discussion. And by the way, if you are watching us online and you'd like to submit a question to the professor, please do so through your question box. You raised a lot of questions there, Professor, but an interesting one is about the policy makers, the decision makers. So it's not the case, it seems, that they don't know what's going on or they don't have a steer as to what can do from the likes of yourself and other experts. Then why aren't the policymakers making the kinds of decisions that really need to be made?
Yeah, of course, that is a political and not a scientific question, and so I really rather more respond to it as almost as a citizen, and as a citizen who has been participating in these exchanges over the years. And I have to repeat, I'm watching both the beginning campaign for the next elections here in France, and I've watched the one in Germany. It is a surprise to me. There's of course social psychological studies that explain to us that there's a general tendency to avoid change, to avoid proactive change, first of all. So that is really a sociologist's question, perhaps, to answer. But I also do think, and that's the purpose, I guess, of this session, that we as scientists, we can do better than we've done. We can provide better synthesis, but we also need to more directly address those issues that require change, and the energy transition is one of them. and the transition in other sectors, in the agricultural sector and in transport and so on. There are others, and there's of course a lot of work going on, but it's very technology oriented. It's very much based on the idea that there's technology fixes, and there's actually very little proof from the past that this is the most promising way to resolve the kinds of problems that we have before us. That's my spontaneous answer, but I'd like to hear others.
Yeah, and we'll be very good to get our panelists' reaction to your points of view as well. But how long will this transition take then, do you think? I mean, the realities of energy shortages and the costs of energy are really hitting home to people in many parts of the world, and certainly in Europe. So how many more examples of what's coming down the line do people need before they start realizing, you know, pain needs to be taken and changes need to be made?
Perhaps we should remind ourselves what the situation was in 2015, because in 2015, at the moment of the signature of the COP21, many of us had the feeling that we had achieved some breakthrough. For the first time, we had seen a commitment that actually was in direct response to countries that are threatened in their very existence by climate change. And we also saw a target. We saw a target determined by policymakers, which was the well below 2 degrees target. And many of us, I think at the time, said, okay, we give you we tell you how much time it takes. You need to you really need to be neutral in terms of any more emissions to the atmosphere by about 2050, better by 2040. Now let's get there. And since then, we're seeing declarations in that sense from governments where we have to go back to them and say, come on, this is not enough. So in 2015, I would have given you the answer, yes, we are on track. It will take a few decades of really hard discussions and work. Now we are 6 years later, and frankly, the absence of credible steps forward, it makes me much less skeptical about this. How long will it take? I think we will have to see a lot more very dramatic crises with a lot more lives lost, and with a lot more people ending up in poverty before maybe something more dramatic happens. But I don't dare to make any scenarios for that at the moment, unfortunately.
And you posed yourself 2 questions that you said need to be addressed. I want to go back to the first one that you posed there in your slides, which is, given that current policies for the protection of climate and biodiversity are so clearly inadequate, they're your words, do we really need new science for better policies? Can you answer that question?
Well, it was, of course, a little bit a provocative question. I mean, in the first round, I do want to defend the ongoing science that takes place in order to even better understand the risks and the technologies for adaptation. I don't at all want to say that we need to stop this. In contrast, it's also important for the general knowledge building that these scientific efforts continue. But the science for transformation, I think, still has a very low status, even in the scientific community. But many of my ecology colleagues, for example, think this is kind of it's too soft for them, and they're not sure this is something they can do. And I think we need to be much more brave in that sense. And of course, we need to provide the financial opportunities also for that, and the real struggle, and I think that is going to happen, but the real struggle that I see is against the naive technology optimism, which is really something that hasn't produced results so far, and that has absorbed basically a far too large share of the effort, both intellectual and financial effort in science. So transformative science means something else than just building machines that are a little bit less energy consuming than the previous machines.
I just want to put one question, Professor, that has come in from one of our attendees before we open it out and bring in our panelists. So our attendee wants to know, given the expected reductions in water availability in the Mediterranean, should we not aim to convince decision makers also to that and work on measures to reduce water use?
Certainly, and this is one aspect where the MEDIC report cites a number of examples. that obviously we can become more efficient in our water use, and we will have to do that. In some way, you know, if you take a longer time perspective, then you would say that even on a century time scale, people have been able to adapt to differences in climate, to, for example, also more water shortages. So we should, of course, make use of all our best technologies and abilities to adapt the agricultural sector to less water use. In some cases, however, the water is still there, but it becomes more saline, because associated with sea level rise, and this is the case in most major river deltas in the Mediterranean, including the Nile Delta. And then there is, well, you could of course start desalinization of this water, but that is and it's possible, and we will have to even do that. So we should use all options for adaptation. What I'm basically saying here is that there is no amount of adaptation that will resolve the problem for us if we do not address with the root cause, and the root cause is climate change and biodiversity loss.
Okay, Professor, stay with us. Thank you for that. And again, if you would like to ask the Professor a question, fire it in through the question channel on your screen. Now, though, I'd like to introduce the rest of our panelists for our Q&A session. And can I ask all of you that you unmute yourselves and you turn your cameras on? They've been waiting patiently behind the scenes. There we go. So I'd like to welcome now Gidon Bromberg. He is the co-founder and Israeli director of EcoPeace Middle East. EcoPeace is a regional organization that brings together Jordanian, Palestinian, and Israeli environmentalists to promote sustainable development and to advance peace efforts in the Middle East. Our second guest is Irene Sander. She is the Global Nexus Secretariat with Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, GIZ. I hope I pronounced it correctly, Irene, but it's German International Cooperation in English. And as well as coordinating overall secretariat support to the regions, Irene also facilitates investment dialogues on Nexus at a global and a regional level. I'd also like to welcome our third panelist, Carlo Giapponi. He is a professor of applied economics at the Department of Economics at Ca' Foscari University of Venice in Italy, and he is the Dean of the Venice International University. His research activity focuses on sustainable science and global change. And our final panelist is Hani Siwilham. He is a professor of hydrology and water resources management at the RWTH Aachen in Germany. He is currently the Rector's Delegate for African countries, and he's the Managing Director of UNESCO Chair in Hydrological Changes and Water Resources Management at the RWTH Aachen. He's also a professor at the American University in Cairo. Forgive me if I have badly pronounced some of your names, and if it's okay, if you don't mind, I'd like to stick with your first name so that we can run smoothly through this. But I suppose what would be good is maybe if I could initially get your responses to the question we are to tackle during this session, but feel free to fire in some more information you would like for us to discuss too. And we'll go around and we'll bring in Professor Kramer as well to have a kind of a lively, dynamic, interactive panel debate. And so the opening question is, what kind of changes do you think are needed in science to enable Nexus policy decisions by consensus? So Gidon, if I can go to you first for your responses to that question.
So thank you very much, Karen, and for the organisers for this opportunity to speak. Thank you, Professor Kramer, for your opening comments. I think that coming from civil society, we very much depend and of course welcome the scientific evidence that is being produced. And I can tell you that if there's something that at least the water authorities in Palestine, in Israel, and in Jordan can agree on, is that climate change is real. The climate change, the climate crisis is already happening, and that if nothing is done, this will be a threat multiplier that threatens the stability and the security of us all. And that's completely due to the strong science that that you and others have produced. I think you can sort of count on your fingers where Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians can agree on anything. And certainly our work in the region highlights that that there is a very scary understanding. I mean, we already are experiencing since the 1950s a 2-degree increase in temperatures. I mean, it's already present. The Mediterranean in Tel Aviv beach was 32 degrees Celsius this summer, 2 degrees higher than its average, and that's now. It's not talking about by the end of this decade or the middle of this century. And therefore, given the acknowledgement that there is a crisis, we do see some opportunity. At Ecopeace, we launched a report and a call for a green-blue deal for the Middle East, which is firstly focused on policymakers in Palestine, Jordan, and Israel. And in one of the chapters of the Green-Blue Deal, we very much highlight a water renewable energy nexus. And here we look at the need to deal with the climate crisis through consensus building, through cooperation. And with German government support, we researched how could we create healthy interdependencies between Jordan, Palestine, and Israel that both advance climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And our study concluded that, for instance, Jordan has the comparative advantage of vast desert areas, or because of its vast desert areas, to produce renewable, particularly solar energy, at prices and at scale that is very attractive. It's cheaper than what Israel or Palestine could do, and therefore, given the technological advance, and I know that there's concern just to be dependent on technological advances, but where those advances have taken place, then we need to utilize them. And what we're calling for, and I'll expand maybe in the discussion, is for Jordan to become an exporter of solar electricity beyond her own needs, but to neighboring Israel and Palestine. And the comparative advantage that the Mediterranean coast of Palestine and Israel has is, as you mentioned, desalination. Israel, in fact, already supplies 70% of its drinking water, of its domestic water, through desalination. But here, of course, our call is that desalination be powered by renewables, particularly coming from Jordan. Likewise, the Gaza coast in Palestine has that same comparative advantage because the Mediterranean is roughly 100 kilometers from all of the main population centers, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. And in that way, the water, desalinated water, can meet the climate adaptation challenge, where we through good science, we're very fearful of a 40% reduction in current precipitation levels because of the climate crisis. And in that way, we create healthy interdependence, where for the very first time, Jordanians have something to sell to Israelis and Palestinians, and Israelis and Palestinians have something to sell to Jordanians. And given the technological advances, these are actually investments which are profitable. Renewable energy in our part of the world, particularly solar, is the cheapest source of electricity production. It's cheaper than any fossil fuel. Desalination is, particularly if it's going to be solar powered, will be the cheapest marginal cost of increasing or of meeting the challenges of water insecurity in our region. I want to leave it there to allow others to expand, but what we're seeing is that we are seeing that the private sector are keen to advance these investments, and so building on the good science, building on the opportunities that the private sector sees, we are seeing governments are talking, governments are discussing, and are trying to build consensus, at least on meeting these water and renewable energy targets.
Okay, thank you so much, Gideon, and we'll try and get back to you about some of the challenges politically to maybe reach that consensus, but really, really good points. So Irene, if we can go to you next. So your responses to that, overall question, and then maybe some points you would like to make.
Yes, so thank you, Karen. Thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me to this panel. So as Karen has already mentioned, I am here today representing a very specific program, so the Nexus Regional Dialogues program, which is co-financed by the German government and the EU. And I'm also here representing the GIZ as one of the implementing agencies of that program. So from this very limited perspective of an implementing agency, I'm not going to make a statement on how science should change. I don't think I'm in the right position to do so, but what I can do is I can share some insights on how at an implementing level, when the science is translated into data and then channeled through decision support tools, so in what context those tools are being used, what challenges do we see in using those kinds of tools on the ground for policymaking, integrated natural resource management, and what opportunities we see. So the main message I want to make is that decision support tools, such as hydrological models, for example, they need to be developed together with those that are meant to be using them, and ideally also involve, so the development should ideally also involve those that are going to be affected by the policies that are resulting out of these decision-making processes. This is important if we want this data to be used in practice, so if we want it to be synthesized and actually translate into policies, but also if we want this data collection methods and analysis tools to be used again in the future, so for them to be used and applied sustainably. But another point I would like to make is that these policies related to natural resource management, they happen in very complex socioeconomic situations, and often also in situations where there's acute and very short-term emergencies, which, although I don't want to represent now a policymaker's perspective, but I think it's also important to mention to understand why sometimes some policies are made at the expense of sustainable or of natural resources. So I would like to illustrate these points with an example of how the water allocation planning tool, WEFE in short, has been applied in two different cases with the support of the GIZ. One case was in Jordan and another in Tunisia. Two different approaches were used to introducing these tools with different results. So I will just simplify it. I'm not going to go into the details. But in Jordan, for example, this dates back to a couple of years now. I didn't work on this project directly, but I was involved in the bigger water program at the time. So the idea was in Jordan, a very water-stressed country. We really heard the statistics from the last two speakers. The idea was to introduce this tool, this allocation planning tool, to have a transparent mechanism to justify water transfers between governorates and for different usages of water. So the approach that was taken was the project outsourced the development of the tool to an external consultant that came from Germany, that of course had in his contract also to develop this tool and to also provide capacity development measures for the staff of the ministry. In this case, it was the directorate on the National Water Master Plan at the ministry. The tool was developed. It showcased very nicely the water balance of the country, comparing water supply to the different consumptions of the resource. But what we ended up seeing in reality is that it became more of a knowledge management instrument rather than a policy making tool, because what we saw was that it didn't involve enough of the stakeholders that were affected by the policies that was a result out of this tool. So the idea was that it would allocate water transfers between the different governorates. The governorates, nobody was represented from the governorates in the development of the tool, the process was too centralized. But these lessons learned were not in vain. Actually, the project manager then moved on to Tunisia a couple of years later, and he took the lessons learned with him to the next case study. And in the case of Tunisia, The tool was then used for a very specific purpose with the Nibana Dam, which is a dam in the center of Tunisia. It provides water mainly for irrigation purposes for 4 different governorates in an area that is marked by very high unemployment. It's also one of the governorates is also home to Sidi Bouzid, as we all know. That's the town that had the social unrest lead to a regime change in Tunisia, and then to the so-called Arab Spring region-wide. The region is marked by a population that depends highly on agriculture. And so what we saw prior to the intervention of applying the WEFE tool there was that the organization in charge of the dam allocated water, of course, based on the availability of water in the dam, but also based on requests coming from the governorates. And of course, these were also based on cropping patterns and prioritization, but the data was not clear. It wasn't clear on what grounds requests by these governorates were making on what grounds they were making their requests on. So this tool was this time around applied in a more concerted manner. A national committee was set up, represented by the Ministry of Agriculture, Water Resources and Fisheries, but also by decentralized structures. So with representatives of the governorates, of the organizations managing the dam, and the organization in charge of the transfer of water. And this time around, each committee member was asked to nominate an engineer to form a working group. And the tool was this time around really developed with all the different stakeholders involved in the allocation regime.
Okay, I might just, because I am conscious we need to go to the other speakers as well, Irene. So can you just finish up very quickly, and then we'll hopefully come back to you for another response and another question.
Of course, sorry, yeah, so there was, I ended up going into much detail after all. So basically the point was, this time it was a much more participatory development process that took into account vertical governance structures. So it was not just centralized within the main institution in charge of it, but it really involved all the different actors. And it led to policies that were actually then implemented on the ground with the decision to take this approach and to spread it towards countrywide for the different dams in the country. But I guess I will leave it at this stage, and then.
Yeah, we might, and hopefully we'll get a chance to go back to you to maybe expand on some of those points. Carla, I'm quickly going to jump to you for maybe your opening remarks. You may not want to address that specific question that I've put to both Gidon and Irene if you want to talk around the topic on something else.
Well, I think we can continue to go on the same line, trying to not to repeat too much, but just to maybe underline something that has been already told us by Wolfgang at the beginning, and then some elements that have been mentioned so far. I think we have some important keywords to consider, and that we have always to bear them in mind. Indeed, Wolfgang stressed transformation very much as a need that we have. So if we have to be transformative, it's, I think, evident by definition that we have to change something, and also science and research has to evolve in order to provide those answers that are to be provided in a context that is changing dramatically. We can read whatever reference document from the IPCC to Agenda 2030, and we return always to this idea: if we keep going with the business as usual, we will go nowhere, and we will have a dramatic crisis even much faster than expected a few years ago. So transformation, I think it's what we have to consider. From a scientific viewpoint, probably there are other keywords that we have to consider very, very carefully. The first, I think, is complexity. It's not the case that we go now into the terminological details of some consideration we don't want to go too much in depth, but complexity is indeed our starting point. We are dealing with complex systems, and complex systems by definition are not linear systems, so it's very difficult to imagine how our systems at different scales could evolve in the future. We can think of the planetary system, but we can think also a single city. So there are so many variables, there are so many complex relationships that we cannot make sort of forecast. What we can do is making projections, as we usually do by considering multiple scenarios. So I'm trying to make a list of things that we have to have in terms also of tools to approach this transformation. Two more keywords I would like to mention: the diversity of the things. Indeed, our countries, our cities, our places where we live are indeed quite diverse, and science has really to make a jump ahead in the capabilities to take this diversity into consideration. No more average could be a motto here, no? So, which is a classical approach that we adopt also in economics. We simulate the behavior of a whole country where China has a single value for an environmental variable, for example, which is something that should not happen in the future. We lose completely the capabilities to understand first the phenomena if we average these dramatic diversities that we instead observe. And the last keyword maybe that I would like to mention is discontinuity. This is another, it derives from what I said, you know, with very complex systems, it's very difficult to understand if we are getting close to what we call a tipping point, a situation in which we have a dramatic regime shift and we move to a situation that is completely different from the one we were used to, and maybe also with the irreversibility. So I think that these are, speaking very much in very general terms, these are the challenges that we have to face from, or at least some that we have to face from a scientific viewpoint.
Okay, Carlo, thank you for your opening responses there. And finally to you, Hani, you may want to address the opening question specifically, but it also might be interesting, similar theme really, to talk about the role of research and innovation, and in what way do you think that they can contribute to the WEFE Nexus, especially given that we've such little time left really to reach the SDGs?
Yeah, thank you very much, Karen, and thank you to everyone for this very rich discussion. First of all, what we need to do is to apply what exists. I think we have done a lot of research, a lot of publications, a lot of technological development in our labs. And I totally agree that the decision makers, they need to apply at least part of what exists. If I speak about the technology and innovation, as you mentioned, then we need to move from the low level of TRLs or technology readiness level to a higher ones, to move from technology readiness level 5 to 6 to 7, 8, and 9 in order to commercialize what exists, considering that not all the technologies are for profit making. So there should be a political support for applying some solutions that are not necessarily making profit, but are very important for the community and also very important for the climate change mitigation. So these are the first thing that I think should be done. But speaking also taking from your question about the WEFE and the water, energy, food, environment nexus and their relation to big issues and big challenges, I like always to classify the WEFE Nexus on 4 different levels. The first level for me is a global level. What is the relation between this nexus, even the water energy nexus, the water energy food nexus, the water energy climate, or the water energy environment nexus? At the global level, there are a lot of challenges, mainly the climate change or associated to climate change, that needs to be tackled at such a level. And we have already a mechanism. We have the COP21, we have the IPCC, and we have the SDGs that we have to tackle very soon. So this is a level that we really need to work on. And not necessarily technological, but can be also in terms of modeling or studies or development of interlinkage between water scarcity and climate change. And how can we deal to such connection at such a level? But there are also other nexus-related problems at the transboundary level, at the regional level. So the issue is not always about local water scarcity. There is transboundary issues. There is an issue between Iraq and Turkey. There is an issue between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. And these are associated very strongly to climate change. I mean, people are struggling now for receiving their water in country like Egypt, or like in Sudan, or like in Ethiopia. What will happen with the increase of temperature, as Wolfgang was saying? I mean, what will happen in the future? How they are going to need more irrigation. The more temperature you have, the more crop water requirements you need, the more irrigation water required. And they are suffering, and they are struggling, and they are fighting today. What will happen in the future? So this is the nexus that has to be tackled at the transboundary level. And why it's nexus? Because Ethiopia is trying to generate hydropower from the water, but Sudan and Egypt are waiting for the water for food. This is a very clear interrelationship between water, energy, and food. If you go to the national level, which is the third one for me, how governments and policymakers are going to secure water, to secure energy, and secure food for their population, especially in the South Mediterranean and Africa, with respect to climate change. We cannot stop what's going on. We need to adapt things to mitigate the impact of our activities in the coming years, and not really leave this or leave that. When it comes to the local level, here I really see a contribution of the technology, because I go to the points that were mentioned about water desalination. But I don't agree with all what was said about desalination, because desalination as such today is not a green technology. It's not a sustainable technology. So we have to be very careful when we promote desalination as the solution for everything, that desalination itself has a huge impact on the environment. I'm not against desalination. I have been working on research on desalination the last 10 years, but desalination has two main problems. First, the very high energy consumption, which could be solved, as it was said, by using renewable energy. Totally agree, and this one is almost solved. The other problem that's not solved is the byproduct produced from the desalination. This is not solved, even not solved sustainably. So you just dispose huge amounts of brine in the Mediterranean Sea, and then you take the water again. So you are going to destroy all the ecological and biological life in the Mediterranean or in the Red Sea. I'm speaking about the region where we are. So we have to be careful when we choose this technology and upscale it. And again, we have to think about this nexus in relation to climate change also at the local level. So I think these are the main issues that I want to tackle. But if I just finish by, again, the issue of water scarcity. The issue of water scarcity has a dimension of efficiency of uses. So how can we produce more with less? How can we produce more food with less water and less energy? This is a challenge that we have to tackle, and technology exists, but we don't upscale it because the policy makers are not interested in upscaling technology that's costly and not making the same level of profit. How come in the 21st century and the farmers are still irrigating their crops with the same technology that the ancient Egyptians were creating or using? 7,000 years without almost no change in some countries. So there is a need here to think about applying technology for local uses to tackle issues like water scarcity, plus what my colleagues were saying, desalination, but with more sustainable approaches. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Excellent. All of the points that you have touched on. We are getting questions in as well from our attendees watching online. Maybe before I go back to all of you, to tease out some of the points you made, perhaps Professor Kramer, very interesting points, some of them really reiterating, I suppose, or supporting what you've been saying. Could you give us your response to what you've heard so far from our panelists? I think you're muted, actually, it seems. Are you? I think you're muted. Can you unmute yourself? Yes, I think we have you now.
No.
Can you hear? Yeah, just say a few words. I'm not sure. Oh, I don't know if we have your mic.
I think
Perhaps
we still
not.
don't have you, Wolfgang.
No, I don't think we have. So what we'll do is we'll try and see if you can get the mic sorted, and maybe Guidon, if I can go back to you in the meantime. Very interesting. A lot has been said about obviously the need for policymakers to come together, for hard decisions to be made. In your opening presentation, you talked about the fact that there are solutions, it seems, in different countries in your region. So, but politically, I would imagine extremely sensitive and difficult to get consensus. How do you get that kind of consensus, especially too because it's transboundary, which Hani has touched on as well?
So I think the reason that we're able to, I mean, we're not there yet, so we don't have the, I mean, we've seen a very important sale of 50 million cubic meters of water from Israel to Jordan, agreed in these last months. And I think that's a measure of how water is moving from the Mediterranean desalination to Jordan. That's taking place because I think perhaps as Professor Kramer has said, we're feeling the climate crisis already. Amman was receiving water 8 hours a week, municipal water. And without that additional purchase of desalinated water, Amman would start receiving water once every 2 weeks this summer. So there aren't, choice is not something that is so readily available. I think also the uprising in Syria and the understanding of at least the connection of the climate crisis to that uprising has really brought also home the message of the nature of failed states, that this is knocking on all of our doors and no one is safe. No one's national security will be safe if we don't respond. And I think the advantage of indeed trying to implement technological solutions, and I totally agree that technology can only be part of the answer, and desalination, as an example, should be the last choice, not the first choice. But for countries of the Eastern Mediterranean, we've already come to the situation where it is our last choice, that there is no alternative other than to heavily rely on desalination because of unsustainable past policies. So given the crisis situation that we're already in, we're seeing political buy-in because of real concern to national security. And I think the linkage between the science, the technological solutions, and the national security considerations are very important to be made. And that then motivates decision makers to move forward. Another example of speaking to a little bit of what Professor Sewilam mentioned, absolutely, agricultural practices need to change dramatically, and they won't change if a water scarce part of the world continues to make available water almost free. If the price of water doesn't reflect its scarcity, then there is no incentive for conservation. There is no possibility to employ the technology, drip irrigation, utilizing treated wastewater instead of fresh water to produce food, which is something that the whole Mediterranean will have to adopt. But if we don't get the price right as a critical consideration by policymakers, then we're not going to be able to employ the technologies that help advance the climate adaptation measures that are desperately needed.
Okay, Guillaume, thank you so much for that. Professor Kramer, I think your microphone should be working now. Can you just reach out to us again just to make sure we can hear you? Can you hear me? I think it may be some issue with the line. So I don't know that we can, maybe tech team behind the scenes, you can see if we can fix Professor Kramer's line. In the meantime, though, I mean, Irene, if I can go back to you, that whole issue that Guidon was talking about, you know, the price has to be right and all of that, but obviously these cost a lot of money. People, I know in my own country, in Ireland, where we have lots of rain, but people weren't prepared to pay for water when the government introduced several years ago attempts to bring in water charges, even though people understand how difficult the issues globally are about water shortages. So from your experience, what other factors do you think are necessary for policy built on consensus so that you can get the people on board, consumers on board, and also the decision makers?
Yes, thank you for the question. It touches upon what Guidon said, but also on what Hani said regarding the need for the technologies on the small scale, but also for what we see a lot of technologies being introduced, and projects like the ones that I work for, we jump on board and we promote those kind of technologies. But how do we get those kind of technologies, those kind of solutions, WEFE Nexus solutions particularly? How do we get them to reach a larger scale? How do we upscale them? And Hani already mentioned this problem that often we get stuck at just the introduction level, but not seeing this technology being spread. So on one hand, we work, again, specifically from the implementing agency perspective, often on promoting the demand side, so creating demand for this kind of technology. But what we often, and this is again due to silo thinking, and that's what the next WEFE Nexus spirit is all about, is to break out of the silo thinking, is to think about the supply side. So how do we make sure the technology is also available in those countries? Often what we see again is that technologies come from abroad, they're imported, which makes them expensive, which will then again scare policymakers off of promoting them further. So we need to promote that this kind of technology exists and is marketed at national level. For this, we need to break out of the silo from on thinking just in terms of just on natural resource management, and also think of the entrepreneurship side. How do we promote more entrepreneurship to come up with these technologies and make them available at national level? And then on the other side, how do we convince policymakers to promote and support upscaling of these technologies? For this, we need to convince them that there are costs related to the benefits that they also aim to achieve. So there are definitely upfront costs that are very expensive for technologies such as solar-powered irrigation pumps. But the benefits that they bring about can also be monetized. And for this, we need the evidence. We need to, and this is again an appeal to implementing agencies, we need to generate this evidence. My program.
There's a lot of interference. Everybody else turn off their microphone just till we identify. Okay, so can you all hear me? Just nod if your heads if you can hear me. I don't know, there were some gremlins in there. Irene, anyway, thank you very much for that. I think you nicely sort of touched on some of the issues that might help in that sense. So Carlo, what I might ask you to do is, for the rest of you, until I go to you, keep your microphones on mute just in case that gremlin reappears. Carlo, if I can then go to you next, because again, you've touched on these issues about the challenge of transformation. But there's an interesting question that's come in from one of our attendees. And forgive me, Shmuel, if I'm mispronouncing your name, Shmuel Yerushalmi wants to know, how can Nexus targets be integrated in social policy and policies to enable the resolution of social and economic problems of countries? Carla, maybe you can answer that question for us, please, and maybe respond to, yeah, big question.
Yeah, big question indeed. I think we have to consider that, I don't know from where to start, but in any case, the Nexus, what is it? The Nexus is the acknowledgement that we cannot approach problems in a sectoral way as we used to do in the past. This is more or less what the Nexus means for us. And we have identified 3 sectors or 4 that are particularly that have particularly strong interlinkages. And the water, energy, food, and the environment is it's a declaration of this need. So, in order to proceed in this direction, what we have to do is to have means, approaches, allowing us to take decisions that eventually probably are still sectoral decisions, because probably we have a decision that shall be taken by the Ministry of Agriculture, for example, okay? Because we do not have a ministry for the WEFE, okay? So what we have to do is to guarantee through this approach that we call the Nexus, that we have the possibility to explore the consequences of decisions that we take still in a sectoral manner in several other important sectors. In order to do that, we need to have a matrix. So we need to measure the consequences of our decisions in different sectors, even out of our competencies. I return to the example of a single ministry, okay? So, and this is something that, of course, we should not approach with a trial and error approach, but we should be able to anticipate. I said before, we cannot make any forecast in such complex systems, but still we can make projections of the expected consequences of our decisions. So this is what we have to do. We have to have a set of metrics allowing us to anticipate the expected changes in several different dimensions and support our decision in a way that we can obtain and meet the sectoral objectives, having possibly a series of positive side effects instead of negative side effects as we were used to see in the past. I think that climate change sciences taught a lot to all of us how to approach this. If we think at adaptation, for example, the studies on adaptation are in fact about this, and the balancing between mitigation and adaptation is again about this. So our capabilities should be really to have a system of coordinated actions, and each of these actions should have a clear perception of what are the propagation of side effects that each of them will generate. And in order to do that, we should have a matrix, as I said, and one example is the SDGs. The SDGs, 17 SDGs with under 70-something targets and indicators, is a system that we can adopt for this in many circumstances. In some cases, they are too generic, they are difficult to calculate, etc. But something similar or an evolution to this can provide us what we need. So a systematic assessment of all the main dimensions of the problems and a way to understand how our decision propagates effects.
Okay, Carla, thank you very much for that. I'm going to very quickly go to you, Hani Sibilam, maybe for your responses to probably what's going to be time-wise our last question. It's come in from one of our attendees watching online, Shlomo Wald. So Shlomo wants to know, don't we have communication issues transforming data from scientists to policymakers? Scientists choose the easy way by presenting certain ways for progress instead of checking options. He cites two examples. Why deny fourth generation SMR, which I believe is nuclear technology, correct me if I'm wrong there, and promote just renewables? Improving efficient water, food and energy use is evident, but this policy is not effective to most of the world that suffers from scarcity of these commodities. Hani, is that question okay for you to respond to? And if you could unmute yourself, please.
I will do my best to answer it, but thank you for the question first. Yes, there is a communication issue in both sides, from the policymakers reaching out to the scientists, and also from us as researchers of presenting and selling our ideas and bringing our ideas into practice. So it's not enough just we publish or patent something without being able to adapt it to the implementation. I'm not going to go in the nuclear issue because it's away from my field of expertise to comment on that, maybe one of the other colleagues, but at least in our technology related research, yes, there is a lot to be done in terms of communicating our research results and simplifying them and making them available in a way that decision makers can capture and understand and apply. So communication, yes, confirmed from my side that it's both ways a problem. But also I would like to tackle the issue, and one of the questions that was about the relation between the nexus and the socio-economic aspects. Yes, I think we need to work more on that, how the nexus will help poor farmer, for example. There is definitely many ways to help the poor farmer if you introduce new technologies for the farmer that's based on integrating technologies to water usages like hydroponics and aquaponics. I know it's not a technical session, but there are many new techniques that can help the farmers to maximize and increase their productivity, but it needs building the capacity of the people. So it's not just you provide them with the technology and then turn the key and they go ahead. It doesn't work. You need to take their hands, you need to train them to build their capacity. So there is a capacity building step missing here between the technology available, even if it's commercialized, and the users who should be working on applying them. Before I finish, because I also have to run to another very important meeting like this one, I will just have some concerns about what Mr. Gideon said regarding seeing the water as a good or seeing the water as charging people for water. I have some concerns about this philosophy and this concept. We need to be very careful of start exporting and importing water in its physical sense, because exporting and importing water in its virtual sense happening since many years. We export food products and we import food products, and in each kilogram of these food products, thousands of liters of water was used to produce it. So, but start selling water is something that cannot be easily promoted this way. It has to be studied very carefully, and we have to understand the consequences, because I don't also agree with the conclusion that we reached already the limit that desalination is the last option. I don't think we reached the limit. There is a lot to be done, even in the countries you mentioned, in Jordan and other countries, regarding increasing the efficiency of water use first before starting talking about selling water. We need to promote and give the people incentive, because selling the water is just punishing the people. Before we punish them, we can give them incentives in order to enhance the efficiency and produce more with less. And the technology is available, and we need to build the capacity, and we need to raise their awareness to save more water and produce more with less before selling them water and burdening, adding more burdens on their socio-economical life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And actually on that point, we're going to leave the discussion. Thanks to those of you who submitted questions. As usual, we ran out of time. We could have gone to several more questions if we'd had another hour here, but we don't have. But I want to shout out a big thanks to Professor Wolfgang Kramer for your keynote speech and starting off really this very interesting discussion. To you, Gidon Bromberg and Irene Sander, Carlo Giopani, and finally to you, Hani Suwili Lam. Thank you so much for joining us. You can mute your mics and turn off your cameras, and thank you so much for your participation. And for those of you who are staying with the conference for the rest of the day, don't forget there are poster and breakout sessions coming up after this, so do check out your program as well to make sure that you get to be across all of the poster sessions and the breakout sessions as well for the rest of the day, and of course for the rest of the conference as well tomorrow. It's been my pleasure moderating this very interesting debate. I hope you enjoyed it as well, and I hope that I will see you again sometime in the future. From me, goodbye.